Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the United States Study Center online. My name's Ashley Townsend, and I am the Director of Foreign Policy and Defense at the US Study Center, and I'm very pleased today to be joined by my friend and colleague over in the United States, Christian Brose, the author of the book we will discuss today, The Kill Chain. I'm going to turn over to Christian and introduce him in a moment, but a little bit of housekeeping to get started first. Most importantly, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. The University of Sydney stands on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and future as well. Folks, we have, I would say, the webinar today, which is the one that I've been most looking forward to this year and since we've started doing online webinars at the US Study Center. I'm not sure if you can all see me at the moment. I think we're about to switch over to the video part of today. I'll just wait for that to happen. Oh, there we go. I was going to hold that book up myself. We're here today to speak about Chris's fantastic new book, The Kill Chain. Let me introduce Chris, and I'm going to speak briefly about The Kill Chain. Chris has spent the best part of the last 10 years working in the United States as staff director on the Senate Armed Services Committee on Capitol Hill, where he worked as well as the senior advisor to the late and great Senator John McCain. The Senate Armed Services Committee, for those of you in Australia who aren't quite familiar with the way the US administration works, is essentially the committee in Congress that at the end of the day makes many of the hard decisions about how the United States will spend money, on what it will spend its money, how much it will spend, and how it will work with the Department of Defense to go after the United States' most important strategic priorities. And it does so very much in conjunction with the Department of Defense, as well as with the White House and other interests in the United States defense industrial complex. But in addition to that, Chris is, since leaving Capitol Hill, Chris has moved over to Anduril Industries on the West Coast, where he's Chief Strategy Officer, and is now working in a technology startup that is making its way big into the United States national defense community, with contracts starting to eventuate with defense clients in the United States, which is no small feat. And prior to all of that, he was speechwriter to two secretaries of state, both Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, and also a member of the State Department's policy planning staff. Chris was also instrumental in helping the United States Study Center facilitate, a few years back now, a visit to Australia by Senator John McCain, which Chris, I believe, was one of his last overseas trips, and certainly the last major speech he gave overseas, and which really did get a lot of attention here in Australia, with Senator McCain laying out, if you like, the core principles at stake in US interests and global values, as well as US strategic priorities, at a time when many of us here were getting to grips with what the Trump administration would mean for Australia. So Chris, welcome.
Great. No, thank you so much, Ash. It's great to be with you.
Thanks. And look, you're sitting over there in the West Coast. I'm going to hold this up now. It's the cover is probably as relaxed, I think, as you're looking there, with the jungle scenery behind you. This is the book, ladies and gentlemen, The Kill Chain. It honestly is a fantastic read. We don't always do a buy it right now plug when we do book launches, but this is both the first launch of Chris's book internationally, but also it's one of those books that that is refreshing, because what Chris has done is, I think, with the benefit of more than a decade working these issues, is he's tried to put together a very constructive critique of the system in which he worked. It's not a spill all gossip piece, nor is it a piece that's trying to put the knife into one part of the former bureaucracy in which he worked vis-a-vis another. It's a fair book. It's a very, very sobering read. It's a page turner. And I think it's one that really every Australian interested in these issues should read. because it really zeroes in on two, I think, fundamentally important points, which I'm going to get Chris to explain for all of us right now. The first is that the United States is losing its competitive technological strategic edge vis-a-vis China right now in the Western Pacific. And that'll have profound implications for the alliance that we have with the United States, but also for stability in our region and for the capacity of the United States to play the role that it has played for 70 years in our part of the world. The second part of that is probably more obscure for many folks here in Australia, and that's this. It's that at the same time as this challenge has been dawning on America, another one has been dawning within the United States, and that is that to a greater or lesser extent, the Department of Defense and the US military has been left behind by the most important technological revolution of our time, the information revolution. And that's something which I think many people here in Australia think just can't be the case. The United States is the most sophisticated, advanced military power in history. But Chris will tell us, I think, a little bit why the United States has been ambushed by the future. Chris, over to you.
Yeah, I think you summed it up very well. Basically the point that I make in the book is that the US military, the Department of Defense, US national defense more broadly, has been disrupted on two fronts. We've been disrupted by a strategic competitor in the form of China, and we've been disrupted by this kind of emerging technological revolution that really started with the information revolution in the 1980s, 1990s, and has only accelerated over the past 10 to 15 years, primarily in the commercial world. From the standpoint of the competitor, basically the Chinese military has gone to school on the United States really since the first Gulf War. And they have analyzed how we fight, how we build military systems. They've looked at all the core assumptions that we make as to how we project power overseas, how we fight wars. And they have purpose-built a military to call into question all of those core assumptions. And this has happened, not like a hurricane. It didn't just kind of hit us one day. This has been methodical. It's been systemic. And it's been, a focused effort on the part of China for probably the past 25 years or so. And I think that it's, as I kind of argue in the book, it's something that most Americans don't realize how far it's come, how much progress they've made, and the trajectory that they're on when you start adding in kind of the civil military fusion and sort of the weaponization of emerging technologies like artificial intelligence and autonomous systems and other technologies like that China's very much embarked upon. So, on the one hand, you have this sort of strategic disruption in the form of a competitor that has systematically, built a military to undermine US national defense, and done so at a time where, for the better part of 2 decades, the United States has been very focused on counterterrorism operations, the broader Middle East, kind of instability in that part of the world. The second disruption, which is, every bit as significant, has to do with emerging technology. And, your point about how DoD has been left behind, how national defense has been left behind is really right. And, what I try to underscore in the book is just, how significant this is, because I think most Americans and I think most people around the world assume that, there's, if there's any part of the US government that's functioning relatively well, it's our military, it's our Defense Department. And there's a lot of that is true, but from a technological standpoint, we have been resting on our laurels for a very long period of time. We have become overly reliant on, very large, exquisite, very expensive, very manpower intensive military systems. And we've, ultimately been sort of, optimizing for smaller and smaller numbers of those systems. And meanwhile, what you've seen in the, really in the commercial world, led by companies that oftentimes have nothing to do with national defense whatsoever and have no desire to have anything to do with national defense, has been the development of really an explosion of, artificial intelligence, machine learning, computer vision, kind of autonomy, kind of advanced networking, all these kinds of capabilities that have delivered us many of these technological benefits that we almost have come to take for granted in the Internet of Things, and the access to information, the fact that we kind of walk around every day with, kind of intelligent machines and processes kind of providing us recommendations about things we might want to do, information we might need, having it all at our fingertips. This is not something that exists in, U.S. national defense. Some of the points that I make in the book, just to kind of draw this out and make this real for people. When you look at a system like the F-35, which is an exquisite weapon system, which has garnered the name the flying supercomputer because of just the computer power, the processing power, sort of the sensor fusion that system brings to bear. When you actually look at the core processor inside of that weapon system, and you compare it to, what is, kind of a best in breed commercial embedded computer that is available on a self-driving car, commercial car, truck, that commercial computer is hundreds of times more capable than the processor on the most capable kind of advanced supercomputer inside of the Department of Defense, from a weapon system standpoint. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that, our national defense kind of establishment, it knows how to build hardware. It knows how to build ships and vehicles and, aircraft and things like that. It doesn't know how to build battle networks. It doesn't know how to, weaponize data, how to build sort of advanced communications networks. And certainly from the standpoint of building them around these emerging technologies in a way that allow you to automate a lot of the processes that are now possible to automate so that human beings can work faster, make better decisions. This is still done heavily manually inside the Department of Defense. It's still very stovepiped to an extent that, the two fifth generation aircraft that we operate, the F-35 and F-22, are incapable of actually sharing data together in a digital sense. The only way that they can kind of know where each other are and really communicate information is ultimately kind of pilots talking on radios, which is no different than the way we used to do it, a generation, 2 generations ago. So, we've fallen behind to a very disturbing extent. And I think we have a lot of catching up to do.
Yeah, and look, I want to zero in on those 2 points a little bit: the Western Pacific balance and the technological revolution, unembraced, if not missed so far, in a moment. But first, I want to come to the title of your book, The Kill Chain. I mean, in the book, you tease out a number of scenarios, a number of vignettes, really, that I think get to some of the problems and some of the solutions with the way the United States approaches the kill chain. And that is to say, the way that they understand the battlefield, that operators understand the battlefield, make decisions, communicate those decisions, and then act upon them. You talk about visiting operations centers, military operations centers in the Middle East, that are rooms full of computers, sometimes the size of basketball courts, all wired up, with people shouting orders from one side to the other to try and input data from one system to another manually. You talk about all of the new sensors that the United States has started to develop, sometimes inexpensively, sometimes very expensively, different forms of data that are collected by DoD and that sort of evaporate and not used by the Department of Defense because of a lack of machine learning algorithms and investments that can process that data. That same data, by the way, which were the little kernels of information that made Google what it is today in terms of one of the world's most valuable companies.
Right.
This level of almost getting at some of the sophisticated technologies, processes of the future, but not being able to integrate it, I think is sort of at the heart of your criticism of the United States kill chain and capacity to close the kill chain today. Is that right? Can you explain that for a general audience?
Yeah. So the reason I kind of embrace the idea of the kill chain, which is a term that kind of everyone inside the Department of Defense in the United States, many of our core allies are very familiar with, but really everybody who's kind of outside of that has probably never heard of. I embrace the idea nonetheless, because to me, it actually sums up very neatly the outcomes that we're actually building militaries to achieve. Kind of my core criticism, or one of my core criticisms of our system in the United States, is that we are optimized to produce inputs rather than outcomes. The way we define our requirements, the way we build budgets, the way we kind of program money, the way we build military systems, all of it is geared around the inputs and the sort of the platforms themselves. which totally misses the mark. Ultimately what we're trying to build military forces to do and operate them to do is this outcome that in DoD or defense parlance is referred to as the kill chain. And it is a process, as you kind of laid out a second ago, that starts with generating understanding, just orienting yourself, understanding what's happening in an area where militaries are competing on a battlefield or elsewhere. That leads to decision-making, human decision-making about what actions to take, what to do in order to gain military advantage. And that then leads into actually the actions themselves, commanding and controlling effects on the battlefield to kind of effectuate your will. It is a sequential process. You don't want to make decisions or take actions in the event or in the absence of understanding. That usually leads to mistakes and fatal ones at that. It is a process that leads you to think differently about the kinds of military systems that you want and that you need. Rather than being so fixated on the number of systems we need, a 355 ship Navy or 386 squadron Air Force, the things that are very easy to count, the things that are very easy to measure, that allow kind of bureaucracies to fight for their portion of the budget because they result or sort of, kind of can be summarized very neatly in sort of bumper stickers. The kill chain is really something that is focused on how militaries achieve comparative advantage on the battlefield. And, ultimately for me, it's less about the technologies and capabilities that enable a military to achieve that process of understanding, decision-making, and action. Those are just kind of instrumental. But ultimately what you're seeking to do is move through that process quickly, effectively, and in a scalable way so that you can go through over and over and over again that process of understanding, decision-making, and action. For me, it was also, a helpful way or a helpful lens through which to view this question of emerging technology where, again, we ultimately are talking about how human beings are going to relate to increasingly intelligent and autonomous machines and systems. And for me, that kill chain sort of puts a very clear kind of focus on the fact that what we are talking about is very different than, commercial technology. I mean, this is matters of war and peace, life and death. It's something that we have to, kind of accept and embrace, very soberly. And ultimately, I think, it's something that the human being has to be at the center at. What we are ultimately talking about in the construction of technology and military capabilities are tools that enable and facilitate better human understanding, better human decision-making, and human action, or at least action over which humans have agency and accountability. That to me is the core of this whole thing. And I think it's a helpful framing for how to think about all of the different issues at play when we're talking about defense and technology.
Yeah, and then I think if we take that that idea of the kill chain and that idea of updating the kill chain for the future, and we then apply it to the Western Pacific, I think we really get to some of the parts of the book that are most urgent, in my view. I mean, you paint a picture of future warfare, potentially future warfare in the Western Pacific, and really, just as a side here, as a way of painting a picture about the kinds of systems that are needed to prevent future warfare through deterrence, of course. But nonetheless, you paint this picture of the future where warfare is characterized by the ubiquity and the speed, the superhuman speed of advanced technologies that are being mobilized both ways, or at least that will be mobilized against the United States and its allies if China is successful here in the Western Pacific in its Made in China 2020 campaign, 2030 campaign, in its efforts to make China the most technologically advanced great power on the planet in the coming decade. I guess the point about this is that the speed and the space of conflict is going to be like it never has been before, where you have networks of digital intelligent machines that are able to sense, to share information, and then to shoot, to use your framework, at targets rapidly, it's the speed of light in some cases, and that will require the kinds of investments in similarly potent but also defensively oriented systems by the United States, if they even want to be in the position, if the United States even wants to be in a position to hold the line in parts of the Western Pacific. We see a little bit of it now, the proliferation of Chinese ballistic missiles and cruise missiles here in the Western Pacific is already causing serious problems for US access and influence in the region, for Allied access and influence in the region. But it's all going to get quite a lot worse. And your answer to this problem is battle networks, is investing in battle networks by fusing the technology of the future with the kinds of effects that will be required. Can you explain what a battle network is, again, for a general audience, and how the United States should go about investing in building one that can withstand that sort of future you've just teased out?
Yeah. So, you know, in the book, I try to kind of boil it down to its essence. And for me, a battle network it's people and things. And with respect to the things, they're exactly as you said, they're things that sense, you know, that gather information, make sense of information. They're things that shoot, you know, and by shooting, I think we mean, you know, sort of creating effects, you know, whether it's kinetic effects, lethal effects, or kind of non-kinetic electronic warfare, cyber effects, et cetera. And then it's things that facilitate the movement of information between, you know, deployed military systems. You know, I tend to focus less on, you know, what are the specific, you know, kind of nodes in that network. You know, is it an aircraft carrier? Is it, you know, a bomber? I focus more on the ability to bring, you know, kind of mass to the battlefield, and then to operate at speeds that we haven't seen before. I think those are the two things that, you know, as I try to think through kind of what are the real effects of this emerging technological revolution going to be on national defense. It's speed and scale. You know, you mentioned speed, and I think hit it well. You know, we do things on timelines now that are, you know, hours, days, weeks, months in some cases. We're going to have to get that down to, you know, seconds, minutes, because ultimately what we're talking about here are, you know, systems, machines that are going to be much more capable of doing things on their own with limited human kind of direct control. You know, we have a lot of quote unquote unmanned systems in the United States military right now, as does Australia. But when you really kind of look under the hood, there are exquisite numbers of human beings that are required to make those platforms operationally relevant. I mean, you look at a Predator or a Reaper unmanned aircraft. Almost every task that system is performing, you know, from piloting it to steering the sensors to processing the data that's coming off of those sensors, it's all done manually. You know, so we have a military built around, you know, kind of many people to a single platform. And as those platforms become more autonomous, more intelligent, we're going to be able to move to a military where you have many platforms to a single person. Where you have one person who's capable of commanding and controlling larger numbers of more autonomous systems, without having to control the, you know, kind of the, you know, everything that system does. It's going to be able to delegate, you know, more responsibility, more of those military tasks for kind of rudimentary things, collecting information, making sense of information, surfacing insights. And then sort of orchestrating the decisions or effects that a human being wants to carry out. You know, that is going to enable a growth in battle networks, you know, in terms of the sheer quantity of systems that are going to be fieldable. I would argue kind of an exponential increase as that ratio of humans to machines is inverted. With that scale comes speed, just the ability of those systems to be ubiquitous, to be everywhere, sensing, collecting information, you know, closing down places to hide, being able to direct effects against systems once they're found. That's going to make them very difficult to survive. And I think, you know, to your point, the net effect of that for the United States is going to be that if we aren't more physically present and forward present in the Asia Pacific region, you know, we're going to be commuting to a fight that's going to long have been over by the time we show up to it. We are not going to be able to rely upon, as we have for many years, these very small numbers of large, expensive, exquisite manual platforms. We're going to have to shift to a battle network built around almost the opposite, you know, much larger numbers of smaller, cheaper, much more autonomous systems. that can be replenished very quickly when they're lost in military operations or in combat.
Yeah, and I mean, that gets to the heart of some of the capability changes that are required. I mean, shifting from crews per platform to platforms per cruise is the framework. What that means in practice is also that you're looking at unmanned systems, of which you can buy many of, that are either cheaper or more attributable because they don't have humans on board, but are also more resilient when it comes to particularly networks of sensor drones, for example, because you can lose any one of them, any number of them, and yet not lose the overall picture. You're sharing less data between platforms. You're not shipping it all home.
Right.
It's a full court press rather than homeland, rather than a hub and spokes model, rather. And so that makes you more agile. But when it comes to those new platforms, and let's just zero in on two here. You speak a bit in the book about the Valkyrie, the Air Force's drone, and you also speak a little bit about the Orca, which is a potential complement or replacement to a Virginia-class submarine, respectively. And we're speaking generally here. You could buy 20 to 30 of those unmanned systems for every one of the capital investments that are currently being made. And yet, you've talked about in the book how, I mean, with those systems, we're not yet buying them in mass. That's probably enough for the operational requirements, but we're also not buying them or planning to buy them. The United States is not buying them or planning to buy them at a scale that makes the development of those in other forms of advanced, technologically pushing the boundaries capabilities viable for Silicon Valley companies. So that actually poses a structural problem for the kinds of defense innovation that you want, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, I think the value of having a military built around larger numbers of lower cost things is that it reduces the barrier to entry for new entrants who want to come in and work in national defense. I mean, I also think it has the benefit of adding up to a superior capability because, you are ultimately putting mass back on the battlefield in your favor. And, that's the thing about military systems is, even the most exquisite system is not capable of being in two places at the same time. As the old saying goes, quantity has a quality all of its own. And we now are, I think, capable of building a military at scale, or a military that scales independently of additional manpower and additional cost, which has always been the factors that have allowed us to build larger scale militaries. From the technological standpoint, I think the challenge for national defense from the United States standpoint really is more conceptual at this stage, which is thinking through what we actually want these systems to do. So you mentioned the Valkyrie system, the kind of low cost attritable aircraft program that the Air Force has embarked upon. There's been a debate for many years over what role that system is going to play. And we're having sort of theological arguments about, is it going to be kind of fighter escort? Is it going to be, kind of ground attack? Is it going to be, a comms node? My answer is we'll just start building it. Just start moving forward, pick a mission and move out and then add more as it becomes more capable. Ultimately, I think that's the only way we're going to move into this future is we're going to have to experiment our way into it. And the value of these systems is because they're lower cost, we can afford to take more risk. It's not like, we're embarking upon, a 15-year shipbuilding program. These are, relatively speaking, lower cost systems that we can afford to take risk and begin to work out sort of the technological details and attributes that they're going to need to have, and which frankly, I think, we still have a lot of learning to do in terms of what is operationally desirable, what we want these systems to be capable of doing. And then, from a technology standpoint, what is the realm of the possible right now? And what is that technological boundary going to be able to, or, where is it going to be in a year, 2, 3 years from now? That's something that we just need to start working through rather than, planning for what we think is going to be true 5 years from now and assuming that's where we're going to end up. This has to be a much more iterative process than I think what we've had to date.
Yeah. And look, I'm going to come in a moment to questions from the audience. We've already got a number building up here, Chris, so I'll start to pick them out in just a moment. But I wanted to get to I'll go to one quote from the book first, and that's about the way that you sort of highlighted the urgency of all of this and the urgency of a world in which the United States is becoming a great power again, and a great power that has at least one peer competitor, and what the implications of that really are. And so I'll quote from the book. Here you say that we need to relearn a lesson from history that we've largely forgotten during our 3 decades of uncontested dominance. The great powers are capable of limiting one another's ambitions and rendering many of each other's goals impractical or unachievable, regardless of how desirable those goals may be. Great powers force each other to define their core interests, the things that each is truly willing to fight over, and then to make compromises and accommodations as necessary over the rest, lest competition descend into conflict. This is the messy, unsatisfying, often neglected other side of great power competition, and it is already the reality with China. I think this is a chilling extract for many people. You go on to say that America's goal must now be to deny China the dominance that the United States used to enjoy in the Pacific, really inverting that strategic paradigm by agreeing with the premise that the United States won't enjoy dominance again, and needs to move fast to prevent China from achieving it itself. And that has very significant flow-on implications, not just for the United States and the defense of the US homeland, but also for allies themselves. I'd like you to comment on that, but I'd also like you to maybe take a step back and from your vantage point, from the experience you've had over the last 10, 15 years in the system, why is this a challenge that has been left to get this bad?
I think there's a lot of explanations for that. I mean, look, part of the obvious explanation is that for the past 2 decades, really in the aftermath of 9/11, we were very much focused on a different set of problems.
Yeah.
And I think that explanation only goes so far. We were spending a lot of money on things that had nothing to do with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I would like to think that a superpower is capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time. I think part of the problem is that we've been disrupted over a relatively slow period of time, right? I mean, this wasn't like a crisis that occurred one day that sort of opened our eyes. This has been kind of the rise of China, the gathering of Chinese power has been something that's been playing out, as has their military modernization effort, for the past several decades. I think to go back to the core point, the concern that I had as I was kind of working in the Senate was that we just weren't fully accounting for the reality of the rise of China and all of its kind of significance. When we talk about great power competition, we talk of China as a great power, and I frankly think that's China's more than that. The Soviet Union was a great power, but at the peak of Soviet power, they were only 40% of America's GDP.
Right.
They were largely isolated from the international economy, and they didn't really have a vibrant and robust, sort of domestic base of technological innovation. China has already surpassed us in terms of purchasing power parity. If they continue on the track that they're on, they could equal our GDP in a decade. They're integrated into the global economy largely as a result of US policy for many decades. And they have a very vibrant, kind of domestic base of technological innovation, some of which for sure they've stolen, or otherwise, gotten their hands on. But much of it they're developing on their own, with world-leading companies and technologies. My frustration was that, I hear a lot of U.S. rhetoric and, a lot of U.S. assumptions about foreign policy, and it feels as if we're living in the 1990s still. And when I look at how China's emerging, when I look at what they're doing technologically, militarily, I think this is a challenge that is far greater than what most in the U.S. have assumed that it is. And the conclusion that I draw from that is, yes, on the one hand, if we're going to look at this challenge realistically, I don't think that kind of restoring American primacy, let me be more specific, restoring military primacy in the way that we've enjoyed it, since the end of the Cold War, in my opinion, is a realistic goal. But I also don't want anybody to think that, well, all hope is lost and we might as well just, board the lifeboats and, get away from the mainland. Like we still have the ability, if we think differently and act differently, to formulate a national defense strategy, working together with core allies and partners, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region, first and foremost, Australia, to defend our core interests and to ensure conventional deterrence, such that we don't have to rely on nuclear weapons for everything, but we also have the ability to keep this competition peaceful into the future. That's going to require us to think differently as far as ends, ways, and means go from our national defense standpoint. But I think that it's achievable. And I think that it's something that is actually quite doable, because many of the things that I bemoan in the book, as far as the increasing difficulty of projecting military power as the precision strike revolution continues to proliferate around the world. Well, the bad news is that projecting military power has become really hard for America. The good news is that if we make the right decisions, projecting military power can be really hard for other people too. Right. Those are the things that I think we need to embrace and think differently about. And if we do, I think we can actually formulate a national defense strategy, multilaterally with core allies and partners that can address our needs into the future.
I think that's absolutely right. And Chris, I mean, we put out a report last year at the study center called Averting Crisis, where
fantastic.
Thanks, mate. We share many of the judgments that you've come to as well over the years. But like you, it's an optimistic report. It's a bold one, and it's a sobering one, but it's ultimately an optimistic report. And the way that we frame it is that to rebuild conventional deterrence in the Western Pacific, and that is to say, to find ways to deny China the capacity to exercise undue influence or coercion over regional allies and partners. It is ultimately a matter of working to our strengths, but working together. Collective defense is the framework. And right. I think you say in the book as well that it's only by working with frontline allies that the United States is going to be able to restore a favorable balance of power in the region, simply because of geography, simply because of political will, simply because of the credibility of threats made by countries on the front line that are standing up for their core interests. To me, this is an open space. It's going to require a lot of thinking on both sides of the Pacific and in the Pacific, to not just put bets on the technologies of the future, but to put bets on the operational concepts and the diplomacy of the future that will allow us to realize that. Would you kind of come to those same conclusions as well?
Yeah, 100%. And I think we in the United States, we talk a big game with respect to our allies and partners. But I think that the reality is we don't do nearly enough to enable allies and partners to bring them into, our actual operational thinking and planning. There still tends to be this assumption that, well, if things really get sporty, the United States will kind of do a lot of the heavy lifting, and the Japans or Australia's, we'll just sort of sort that out when we get there. My sense is that establishing collective deterrence or collective defense, sustaining deterrence in the future is simply not something the United States is going to be capable of doing on its own. It's not something that any of, or the Australia or Japan or India or whomever, the balancing act that we're going to have to pull off is going to require the collective power of all of those countries working together. You mentioned the geography. That's another core piece for the United States. We're not going to be capable of, kind of magicking a lot of military power across the Pacific on very long timelines, assuming that we're going to have sanctuaries from which to operate, that time is going to be on our side. We're going to have to be much more present in the region. We're going to have a lot more military capability forward. And that inevitably puts us in the position of being much more reliant upon, much more dependent upon our allies and partners, the military capabilities that they bring to bear, the interoperability that those systems have with ours, and ultimately the political interests and sensitivities that those allies have to what our goals are and how we're going about achieving them. The U.S. isn't going to be able to go this alone. And ultimately, I think that points back to the point you were alluding to, which is, ultimately, I think what we're trying to defend here is a system and a way of operating, a rules-based order that we very much, I think, share values in how that system came about and what we want it to look like in the future. That is something that inevitably brings us together. And I'd like to see us getting back a lot more to that. I think the past several years, unfortunately, have been, featuring much more, kind of the United States picking fights with allies on things that we should be, kind of drawn together over. And my hope is that, in the future, we'll be focusing much more on the things that bring us together so that we can, kind of actually pool our power and resources to address these emerging challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And I fully share your point about the need for, if that is to happen, for the United States as well to reform some of its ITAR restrictions and some of its the ways that it has either until now sort of made it more difficult to share advanced technologies, to share military planning, to share objectives and the self-strengthening activities that lay behind achieving those within the tent, so to speak, within the Five Eyes, within the US-Australia alliance. And I think that there's a lot of work that the Centre's been doing to sort of advance that cause. Look, I want to turn now to some of the questions. Folks, in the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. If you haven't already, please do add your questions in there and I will come to a selection of them. I'm going to go first, Brad Glosserman, to your question. Brad, a good friend of both of ours, I'm sure Chris, is asking about how your recommendations and really your framework differentiates from the recommendations that Bob Work has advanced over the years. And I think in particular, the framing that Brad's alluding to is the third offset strategy that was championed by him during the Obama administration, and I think which still exists to a certain extent, although under different language. Do you embrace the third offset? Do you go further? Where do you sit on that issue?
Yeah, I think look, Bob Work is someone I've learned an immense amount from. He's a friend, he's been a mentor, and I think he did an immense amount to begin shifting the department to a focus on great power competition and emerging technology in the time that he was deputy secretary.
Absolutely.
I think that actually, much of what the department is doing right now is a continuation of the work that he began. I think a lot of what I'm writing in the book is very consistent with the things that he was advocating at the time, which, I was very much kind of working from the other side of Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill and doing my best to, support the budget requests that were coming over for these kinds of advanced capabilities. And then wherever possible, trying to free up additional space in the budget for more of that kind of work. I think to some extent, there's a military officer who once made the comment to me that the third offset's an interesting idea, but we're still struggling to get through the second offset. And I think there's a large degree of truth to that. I think with respect to the third offset as well, there's a lot about it that still needed to be fleshed out. And honestly, a large part of the reason I wrote the book was that I found a lot of the conversations that we were having in Washington about emerging technology and national defense just didn't close for me. The question that I kept coming back to is like, well, so what? What are these technologies going to allow us to do differently? How are they going to allow us to operate differently? At the 30,000 foot level, the third offset is it's a compelling idea. But what I think the Department of Defense, the Congress, defense industry has needed to do is now take that several levels down to, okay, so we understand at a general level, what we're trying to do, that what these technologies are, why they're important. But how are we going to actually build military forces differently? How are we going to operate them differently? How do we ensure that this doesn't become a conversation about simply just kind of retrofitting all of the things that I've had for many, many decades with artificial intelligence or kind of new technologies? So we're still operating in the same ways with the same things and just, making it incrementally better through the addition of new technology. I think ultimately, what the third offset was about was really thinking about if we took these technologies for what they are and what they allow us to do, how would we build our military totally differently? How would we operate it totally differently? Because that's the opportunity we have right now. So in that respect, if that I think was the impetus behind the third offset, it's something that I was supportive of then and supportive of now.
Yeah, and I think that some of the common threads between the third offset and your book here is also a focus on continuous experimentation, rapidly cycling that to operators, improving it, placing bets on those that work, defining clear operational problems like, Bob Work's challenge now, how to sink 350 Chinese ships in the first 3 days of conflict in the Western Pacific, and unleashing America's latent innovation power to solve those problems. I think are some of the ways forward. And that's a nice segue to the next question by Ramesh Balakrishnan, who's asked, how much has China progressed on integrating AI and battle networks into their military systems that really lifts that threshold for us to then find ways to respond to it?
Yeah, I think ultimately the answer is we don't know, because they're not exactly making that a transparent process. And I think the bigger challenge here, when you talk about a technology like artificial intelligence and machine learning, it's not visible to the outside world, what those, what level of capability those systems have, right? So when you look at the PLA military parade and hypersonic weapons and autonomous aircraft and other unmanned systems that kind of go parading down the street, those could be very manual systems with not a lot of kind of advanced technology inside or under the hood. They could be entirely autonomous lethal weapons systems or lethal autonomous weapons systems. We as the outside world can't see that. It's not like the Cold War where we can count warheads, with satellite photos. This is something that we can only assume based on the level of effort they're putting into it, their declared intention that these capabilities are going to be central to the future of military power, the national effort that they've embarked upon, from a military civil fusion standpoint, to bring these technologies into their national defense and their military. I look at it that way from the standpoint of it's very clear to me what they want to do. And I presume what they are actively seeking to do and spending money to do. How much progress they made, I can't say. I just know that they're waking up every day trying to make progress. And that's something that I think needs to be, it needs to create a sense of urgency in the United States. And frankly, I think in our allies and partners about what we are doing to ensure that, we don't fall behind and end up in a position where China is writing the rules of the road for how emerging technologies, how advanced technologies are governed and used with respect to, military power, as well as, social control and surveillance and, domestic oppression, things like that.
Yeah, and just on the need to reform and not knowing how much China has already achieved, that being unknowable from the outside. I mean, is it fair to say though that the way that China has embraced the reconnaissance strike complex right now, that is to say, it's highly advanced and long-range sensors and long-range missiles, as well as some other enablers and some other military platforms to lock the US out of the Western Pacific at greater ranges, that which is not really certainly not an intelligent battle network at this point in time, but that already that imposes on the United States and on other allies the need to embrace technologies of the future to achieve operational objectives of the present. And I'm thinking here in the book, you talk about one example in towards the end of the book, in the chapter that I like called How the Future Can Win. You talk about the Joint Surveillance Target Attack Radar system that the Air Force was updating, and how that was an example of where a vulnerable old platform gave way to a more distributed, resilient system of networks and of sensors, rather. Is that an example of or can you explain that example as a way of using technologies of the future, if you like, to solve problems of today?
Yeah, I think, your point about where we stand vis-a-vis China is right. I mean, without even getting into artificial intelligence and advanced autonomous systems, I think, the US military approach has already been significantly disrupted by the systems that China has already developed and fielded, from long-range sensors to, kind of advanced precision weaponry. Emerging technologies are just going to make all of that worse. I think from the standpoint of the JSTARS system, it was an experience for me that, I think was an interesting, kind of example for how a system that is in many respects kind of built to resist change, built to, kind of keep systems going, to keep money flowing to legacy systems, whether that's from the standpoint of the constituents that, or the, kind of vested interests in the Department of Defense who want to continue to operate those systems, or the members of Congress who want to continue to budget them and, base them in their states and districts. It was an example of how everything that you would think would lead you to, one outcome could actually be kind of changed and used to lead to a different outcome. Now, the thing I would say is that, we've not actually yet built the replacement that was envisioned as the replacement to JSTARS. I mean, that's still
Right.
very much a work in progress, and I would argue that implementation of that is, looking a little rocky at the moment. But the very
That's
fact
the best
that we were
example.
able to,
That's
well, I mean, this is the problem of writing books, is that you're writing about moving targets and fixing them in place. But look, the point stands from the standpoint that conceptually, the Air Force was able to come forward and say, we cannot keep pouring billions of dollars into a system that is not going to survive against a great power competitor. Even though there are plenty of instances and examples where, in many other parts of the, U.S. military, we're doing exactly that. We are pouring huge amounts of money into unsurvivable systems. The fact that they were able to kind of marshal the, kind of political support for doing something that was very counterintuitive for Congress to do, and sort of take it on faith that we were able to kind of, or that we would have a better system if we embraced this kind of distributed battle network approach, and that we had the time in which to build it. That to me was victory enough. And I'll tell you, as I say in the book, I mean, that was one of the toughest fights that we had that legislative cycle, and it was literally the last decision that got made at the very senior levels of the Congress. And it very easily could have gone the other way. We could be dumping, billions of dollars into an unsurvivable, recapitalization of a legacy system right now.
Yeah, and look, I mean, the book is just full of examples, as is the case in every country, including Australia, of militaries investing in large-scale systems that align with vested interests, either in districts that build those systems, or vested interest in the services that, not for any nefarious reasons, but want to build the best platforms that they've always taken to battle and want to fight the last war better in the future. And right. The buildup of that in the United States and the scale of the US defense budget, running into the billions of dollars each year invested into legacy systems that are essentially non-starters in the kinds of combat environments that we're talking about, it's truly shocking. I mean, from a taxpayer's perspective, it's a shocking revelation. Australia would respond to it by calling a royal commission that would send up a lot of discussion around these sorts of things. It may not actually act on the problem at the end of the day, but would certainly air those grievances. Right. I want to zero into a more productive way of tackling that problem and go to a question by David Estes here, which is this: to address the issues that you've raised this morning, what should the US military and the alliance priorities be for the next president and the next secretary of defense, so that we're not pumping billions of dollars into the wrong systems, and so that we are building the battle networks for the war tomorrow?
So, I mean, I'll give a little bit of a different answer on this. The temptation is just to start rattling off, kind of developmental programs that, should be the things that we think are going to replace, kind of those big legacy systems. I mean, for me, it's much more about getting the process right to make the decisions correctly. Yeah. The reason I focus on the kill chain as a concept is because that is the outcome we are trying to achieve. We have got to set up processes, I would argue as an alliance, I imagine this applies equally to Australia, and it certainly applies to both of us together, that are focusing on, what combination of capabilities will allow us to close those kill chains faster, at greater scales, at greater speeds together. And make that a baseline that we are consistently performing against and using to actually drive programmatic and budgetary decisions year over year over year. Now, there are going to be certain systems that we can't open up to that kind of competition, or they don't lend themselves to, kind of annually recompeting the program. An aircraft carrier is not something that you're going to recompete every year. But there are programs across our militaries, whether it's weapons, cyber effects, command and control systems, kind of lower order systems, certainly kind of newer, lower cost, unmanned systems, where the incentive should be every single year, you've got to open that process up, bring in new entrants, bring in people who want to compete new capabilities, and constantly focus on, what is that mixture of capabilities that's going to get me better understanding, better decision-making, better action, faster, more repeatably. That's the way we need to make these budgetary decisions, rather than sort of resorting, as we often do in the United States, to just kind of assertion and argumentation as to, where to put the lion's share of our defense spending. This has to be much more, kind of real world focused, much more experimental, and much more focused on, demonstrating real capabilities. To me, that's the process that I'd want to see us start putting in place, rather than, kind of competition in the sense that we're going to buy PowerPoint presentations and paper airplanes from industry on the promise that they're going to build them over the next 5 to 10 years. We can't keep doing that. And we can't have, quote unquote, sort of programs of record that are like tenure at university, where once you get it, it's forever yours. It's got to be something that every year, vendors are forced to come back and compete against, other capabilities that vendors or other competitors believe can perform better. But what the DoD's got to do, what we as an alliance have to do, is kind of create that level playing field and sort of the objective criteria to say, this is how we're going to evaluate, what mixture of capabilities are most effective at generating that understanding, decision making, and action.
Yeah, look, I think that's a pretty good place for us to land. We've got a couple of minutes left, Chris. So I wanted to again just go back to a point in the book where I think you draw some really interesting lessons from the Eisenhower administration, and you argue that essentially Eisenhower, who was himself a product of the military-industrial complex, and then went on to be one who wanted to ensure that it was disciplined and acting responsibly in the national fiscal and strategic interests. He was one of the presidents who probably put the most emphasis and took the most risks on finding the best and brightest, setting operational problems for them to solve, letting them run with it, and letting the mavericks punch their way through the bureaucracy. Do you have any sense that that context of innovation, that period really which developed Silicon Valley into the beginnings of what it is today, can come back? And how can you, in your vantage point there at Anduril Industries, or other folks in the innovation sector in Australia and the United States, do their part to get back to that era by working with Washington?
Yeah, so I think, look, the good news is that there are, in the United States, there are a lot of people in the technology community who are eager to do national defense work. A lot of the oxygen gets sucked out of the room by the folks who write letters to the heads of their companies saying they want nothing to do with U.S. military and national defense work. But when you actually kind of look at how many people are signing that letter as compared to the overall number of people in the company, it's a pretty small but vocal minority. The reality is that I think, the technology community in America, frankly, like Washington itself, is a pretty diverse place. There are a lot of people who want to do this work, who'd be open to doing this work because they're patriots, because they're capitalists, because they're engineers who just love hard problems, and national defense is, replete with hard problems. The challenge, I think, is really on the government side to do a lot of more of what Eisenhower did, which was, be much clearer in defining the problems, picking priorities. What are the things that we absolutely have to get right at scale as compared to other things that are of lesser importance. Concentrating the bets that we make, concentrating the resources that we need to put into those bets, and having a process to very quickly determine, who are the winners that I want to sort of build these future programs around, who are the performers who are going to be critical providers of that next generation capability. That to me is something that I think, our defense establishment, broadly speaking, DoD, Congress, industry has really failed at in recent decades. We sort of, try to let 1,000 flowers bloom. We make lots of small bets that never scale into anything significant. We've got to start concentrating more on priorities, sort of the people who are capable of delivering on those priorities, and then really pushing significant resources into the programs that are best positioned to scale and the performers who are best positioned to scale them. That's ultimately like how America got to space. That's how we developed ICBMs, the nuclear navy, a lot of other capabilities from that early Cold War period. It's not to say that it was all perfect, but I think there are a lot of lessons that we need to relearn from that period, and recognize, that sense of urgency that we had in that period of time, that belief that we had that there was something worse than change. That to me is something that we can't get back to fast enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris, I know this is not your intent of the term, but really, and to end on this, I think that's really where you need another kill chain. It's a kill chain. It's a meta kill chain, is where understanding within the defense industrial congressional complex, deciding on how we're going to go about this problem, and then acting fast and collectively, both within the United States across different vested interests, as well as within the alliance and partner network, is the only way that we're going to be able to get after these sorts of challenges outlined in the book. So maybe that's your sequel.
When you said another kill chain, I thought where you were going, and I've come to believe that I'm a first-time author, and I think I aim to keep it that way. Yeah, it's no, I appreciate it, but yeah, I think I'm gonna hold fast for the moment, and not dive into another book project.
Well, look, we'll revisit that conversation in time. How about that?
Fair enough,
Chris.
Fair enough.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Everyone, again, get a copy of this book. It will keep you up at night because it's gripping, but also because its judgments are very, very sobering. They couldn't be more relevant to Australia. Read it, think about it, and let's keep the conversation going with the United States Study Center on ways that we can go about addressing some of these problems, both independently and in an alliance and partner context. Chris, thanks for your time today, mate, and look forward to talking to you in the future.
Great. Thank you very much. It's great to be with you, Ash.
Cheers, Chris.